Here we go. We are now recording. Sorry, guys, we're going to kind of back up here just a little bit so we can get back to it. So going back to the sharing of the screens. You guys are super patient with me. Thank you. Okay. For anyone that missed this, just to say this again, the crimes of America are as much a part of its meaning as its ideals, and to embrace one without the other will lead us nowhere. What does he say here? Obviously, no searching for the meaning of America could turn away from the fact that America was built on the destruction of its native peoples and the institution of slavery. If I could give a small illustration here to kind of explain this in a more abstract or maybe a more microcosmic way. There was a church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that was a very old church, the largest church in Baton Rouge, St. James. And it was something that its rector tried to get them to kind of understand very early on, is that it was founded prior to the Civil War. And it was interesting to hear them talk about things, everything from the altar, the cathedral in New Orleans. The altar was built out of the funeral bier. I couldn't make this up. This is real. The funeral bier of Jefferson Davis. And the original cathedra, the original throne of the bishop in the cathedral in New Orleans, has written on it in the back the fact that it was made by the original bishop's slaves, and that they actually made that from wood from his plantation. So in many ways, what this institution, especially in Louisiana, had to embrace is that, you know, the church, its fixtures, in many ways, the construction of many of the buildings were done by slave labor. And it's something that's kind of a part of us. One of the things that we have to begin with is understanding that, you know, this land used to belong to someone else, A, and B, hold on a second, I've now got Pat trying to get on board. So sorry, it looks like some folks are having some issues here. So let me just send that to her real quickly. Frankly, I don't know how to. I'm going to tell her to go look on the church's Facebook page.
The best way is on the website. You get in immediately.
Thank you. Okay, sorry about that.
I followed the link in the minutes on Sunday, and it took me to another meeting.
Okay, well, I did tell Pat to go to the one on Facebook, so hopefully I know that others have gotten there. So, okay, sorry about that. I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to be on here. And so Needleman then says, also on page 191, these two massive crimes stand between us. I'm letting somebody in here. These two crimes stand between us like the angel of Eden with their flaming swords. No entry to a new understanding of our country is possible without confronting them. And this to me is an interesting reality for us. Sorry, I'm trying to get back to where I can. Okay, all clumsiness aside, we're going to stop being clumsy now. Now, again, what we're looking at here is both the contradiction of the country, but he also says the contradiction of humanity. And this is where I want to tie us back into this idea of the Judeo-Christian understanding of how we are as human beings. The greatness of America as embodied in the Constitution, its legendary leaders that we talked about last week, stand in stark contrast to these titanic immoralities. But neither side of the contradiction eclipses the other. In other words, they both exist together, like unregenerate man himself. In this picture on the side here, we may remember from last week, the struggle between the two natures of man that this statue symbolizes. America is both good and evil at the same time. The meaning of America, like the meaning of human life itself, cannot begin to appear until these contradictory realities are seen squarely, without compromise, and with the feeling and the resolve that are due each of them. We are the noble, legendary leaders of our past, and we are the sins of the past as well. Going from here, what's our solution then? How can we chart a course through here? And what he says is, can there be any further response to the crimes and injustice of America beyond the work of correcting them through programs of social action? And this harkens to what I began with when we were talking about Charles Gore. We are asking about a completely new approach to our understanding of the failures of America, an approach that goes deeper than social programs that may only rearrange rather than repair man's injustice to man. I think what he's trying to say here is what I think Gore was saying. If we really want to make a difference here, we've got to be ready to say it's not just about us fixing with a sort of program solution, but trying to ask if we can look at both our fallen state and our aspiring state as being something that we can find together in that paradox, who we are wholly, completely, in totality. And we begin with the American Indian. One of the first things that we have to say is, can we ever really know who he was? Can we ever feel what was done to him? Can we feel in a way that goes deeper than guilt? Many of you may know that my secretary here at St. John's, Ursula Phillips, is Navajo, and she lives on the reservation with the Shinnecock people, which is where her ex-husband is on and where her children are considered to be natives. But one of the things I want to insert here that I kind of have in contention with Jacob Needleman, a few times you hear me say that. One of the things that makes it so hard for us to understand who and what the Native American is that in 1492, 1493, and the eras around there, by no intentional goal, the culture of the Native American was eviscerated, and it was done by disease. Conservatively, between 70 and 80% of Native Americans from 1491 to 1530 died from disease from exposure to the Europeans, and how quickly it spread in what was an awful pandemic in Native Americans. That's one component. The second component is this. Even including the Cherokee, who later developed a written language, the language of the Native Americans was entirely oral. And that means that information was spread from one generation to the next orally, and in a compressed, terribly compressed period of time. To have that high rate of mortality is to completely gut a society. They didn't live long enough to give the next generation the information that was only conveyed orally. And so in that sense, for us to be able to measure, we really have to try and dig into the ground and extrapolate, because there's no written record for us to be able to pull out against. And more importantly, no written record for them to draw against. I say this humbly and wouldn't want to repeat it in front of many people, but I'll say it anyway bravely. Most of what we think today as Native American society is a dim shadow of things, and much of it is borrowed from some of the later societies that we have access to, the Plains Indians, things like that, because much of it was lost with this high mortality I've just described. I'll let Pat Callhut come in and join us here, pardon me. So what is the next thing we look at? The first thing that strikes us about the Native Americans' relationship is that relationship to nature. Nature for them is the world. We don't understand the Indians' relationship to nature, perhaps because even though with all the knowledge of science that brings us, says Needleman, we simply do not understand nature itself. Which is to say, for us, it's a matter of biology as opposed to an idea of our being integrated into it. It's very, very few people that see themselves, even farmers today, have a very limited sense of identity to the land, the way the Native Americans did, and to an extent do. Someday, I don't want really time tonight to talk about it, but I'd love to give you some insights that I've enjoyed by being good friends with Michael Smith, who's the pastor of the Shinnecock Nation over here at the Shinnecock Presbyterian. Brilliant man, graduate of Princeton Theological, very down to earth, no pun intended in the context of what we're talking about. He's invited me to participate in some things that are having to do with Native American spirituality on the reservation. His statement here, Needleman's statement here, is really not overstated. The entire world for them, the entire universe, is the rhythm of nature. Now, one of the things I loved here was this description he says about seeing it as a child, this first image of a Native American. I put this one as Sitting Bull in here because it captures it, I think. He says, this was a man. Why should he desire this idea of peace? Surely it was power that he represents. When you look at this image of this Chief Sitting Bull, you can see the strength inside of him, the power of the storm in the sky, and wisdom, the secret of the animal in the forest, and freedom from all the social artifices and solitude, his mysterious capacity to be with himself and with the powers of the wild, and courage, his capacity to withstand pain and suffering and silent force, the power to move through nature without making a mark, to disappear into the forest beyond all discovery, and cunning and fighting and skill and physical prowess that could often defeat the heavy-handed genius of the white man. What could peace mean to such a man, he asks. And when you look at that image, I think that captures it. There's something about that seems dynamic and not just peaceful. And says here for us, for many of us, the word peace evokes something static or dull, or some fantasy of endless pleasure or rest or safety. He says the unhindered pursuit of material goods and psychological satisfaction that we feel today in the conditions of the modern world, these goals are taken as ends in themselves and the main source of human well-being. When an individual or community or a nation takes personal gain or one sort or another as the basis of value, the end result is despair. Needleman says man is built to serve. Our well-being and our happiness depends on our capacity to become conscious individuals who are at the same time conscious instruments of a greater universal purpose. This picture I put behind here is one that I think is so important. If you're a computer scientist, you played with these for years. This is called a fractal.
Fractal, yes.
And each one of those little shapes is actually made up of many, many, many much smaller of the identical shape. Each one of them is a cellular individual that when added to others and others in replication becomes the same thing larger. And that is what a fractal is. And this is the idea of us belonging in some way then as one small piece of a greater whole that is just like us. And so this balancing image invokes for us this idea of peace. For the Indian, peace is hugely dynamic. It includes all the forces of life in nature and in man. It does not exclude what we call evil. It includes, and it does not exclude, struggle, suffering, and sorrow. It includes the whole range of error and foolishness. It includes passion, tenderness, but also anger and defeat. This is something that my wife and I were just talking about today. The struggle sometimes is the thing that makes us, as the old saying goes, makes us stronger. As a fireman, one of the things I learned very early on, this is kind of funny to me, pardon me, one of the things that we had to do is we were told that modern lumber is not as strong as vintage or heirloom lumber because most of it is grown in a plantation for trees. And in order to hasten it, they only give it optimum conditions for growth. And the end result is it doesn't have the inherent tensile strength that heirloom wood does because it's been gone through difficult times and has made it a stronger wood. It's an interesting corollary for us. So justice in the case of a Native American, to be at peace with the community or to live in peace with other nations, to submit to a rule of law that is the communal expression of conscience. And that provides condition within an individual is free to listen for that voice within himself, what is called the intelligence of the heart. And in turn, an effort of exceptional people working together to respect each other's individual fragment of the truth until an objective, all-inclusive truth descends into the community from above. Such an objective moral truth may be linked with the word justice. And this is something that we as Christians hold into. It's part of the reason that we live in church and we live in community, is this belief that we need each other to be able to understand the truly deep and transcendent things. And so these moral questions come up. Justice is that which sees the place of everything in ourselves and in our relationships in nature and in the life of society. Justice not only sees the place of everything, It feels the place of everything. Justice is that which knows what to do to restore things. This is crucial for this chapter, to restore things to their right place and knows when and how to do it. But such a justice does not necessarily conform to man's subjective predilections concerning what is fair and right. And so this question is how to think and live in a manner that conforms to cosmic law. Needleman is beginning to get us to do something that I think as Christians we often forget to do. And you're going to hear about that. We're talking about moralization and moralism. We begin to want to condemn things. And this is my cancer culture drum that I beat a lot, that I think is so contrary to the gospel and is so counterproductive. Because when we moralize, we look at something and say it's evil, and we want to kill it and destroy it. But what we lack then is that, and this is part of what he calls later in this chapter, the unforgivable sin, the ability for something to be redeemed. And that to me is one of the crucial things that this book brings out. If we only judge something from the perspective of its sins, then we commit the worst sin possible. We refuse to see that as a child of God or even an idea of God, it's something that can be redeemed. Again, this is the reconciliation and paradox idea again, the two sides. Needleman says it is the ancient and eternal question of man, the bridge between heaven and earth, between levels of being in the universe. Man, the being of two worlds, two natures, two direction. Man, the contradiction, and man, the reconciliation. Religion and culture of the American Indian rests on the perennial concept of the meaning of human life on earth. To live at peace is to embrace life in all its aspects, all the four directions, all the winds, all the creature outside and within. And I bring this out because that's something that we sometimes lose in Christianity. The cross that I show here of Christ is the thing that reconciles us. It breaks the pattern of just sin and judgment. The opposite of the sense of peace and justice is that which divides and separates parts of reality and keeps things these parts away from each other. And this is what's causing us so much damage, I believe, why I bring this book to you in this Lenten season. If we divide ourselves and if we become so fractured and moralizing about each other, we not only keep ourselves opposed, but we really risk something far worse. We risk losing ourselves as a nation. We might even fail as a nation. Continuing, he says, morality becomes moralism when it imposes a sense of good and evil that diminishes the interconnectedness of life. Certainly, there are things that must be destroyed, killed, but only for the purpose of allowing the whole to restore itself. That is so lost for us today. And so what of division and reconciliation? He says, our moralism compels us to destroy. More often than not, mainstream religious and ethical moralism crystallizes the separation between parts of reality in the form of dualism such as mind and body, spirit and matter, man and nature, life and death. I might even say left and right, conservative and progressive. It is comfortable and habitual for the ordinary mind to perceive in this dualistic way. We kind of feel comfortable there because we can see black and white better than seeing black and white. Now, I mentioned this a little bit, but this is something he says about oral communication. I disagree with him. I think it's a big deal that we lose, that their oral communication left them with a broken thread. But here's what he says. How did the Indian manifest and communicate this profound doctrine of objective peace and justice? The civilization of the Indian comprises hundreds of tribes, scores of language, countless images, symbols, rituals, stories, myths, legends, and tales, by which the teaching of dynamic peace and the care of the earth was transmitted to people. And the important fact is that these stories were told. The ideas they communicated were passed between people in the medium of a human exchange of attention and feeling. It is not simply the content and wit or depth of the stories that are important. Of even greater importance is the means by which they were transmitted. So in that sense, an oral culture like this carried something far more robust. I think that's why I think it's so important when people, it's kind of a personal anecdote. I'm always reticent to record sermons, and I guess this is what I'm doing right now. It kind of edges me a little bit because I want this to be something that's shared by people in a moment. And I think if we even record something, much less write it down, it becomes something, it loses that sense of intimacy that would have otherwise been conveyed in person. Now, he makes an interesting point here. He says that Native Americans were essentially a different state of consciousness then. The Indian culture was a culture rested on a different state of consciousness than does our modern civilization. Our modernity has lost its relationship to the wisdom tradition, the seeds of which were carried in the minds and hearts of many of those who first came to these shores from Europe, but were forgotten in the material expansion and success of what he calls our empire. Not only was a way of life lost, but also a way of seeing, that states, a state of being, a state of consciousness. And he makes the judgment call here higher than our own. I think it's worth here pausing for just a moment to say, he obviously makes a very monolithic interpretation of Native Americans. I'm sure there were heretics and slackers in your average Native American community as well, nor are we devoid of these things. But what he's trying to do is to sort of describe how sort of socially and anthropologically they were different than we are. And by the way, different than they are now, really. So with this idea of what we've just heard about the Native Americans, what is the aim of America then? Now, this is an interesting one. He says here, the earth is more than what we take it to be. More than an astronomically defined planet, the earth is the sphere within which all the forces of God's creative creation play themselves out. And there is something necessary about these forces of resistance, as necessary as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who was, after all, placed there by God himself. One of the most important things that we should embrace in the story from Genesis, in my opinion, despite science, and I think even despite the idea of evolution, one of the most troubling things about evolution for Christianity in the 19th century was, on its surface, it seemed to take away the uniqueness of humanity. If we were just another animal that became as cool as we are because we progressed through evolution to be like we are, then we were no longer God's special creature. But also lost there is a sense that even barring there being other life on other planets, and knowing that actually this is but one planet, third rock from the sun, in part of a much larger galaxy, itself part of a much larger universe. In this place, in this earth, this is the place where God is playing out in the material world, material universe, his special action. I often say to people that what would I do if a little green man came out of a spaceship one day? I would first rush to tell him about Christ, not just because I'm a Christian, I want to convert him to Christianity, but because the reality is if God has pierced into this universe from being something utterly outside and other than it, he didn't do it twice. And we're the special place that needs to let them know that that's happened. That's what this paragraph, the sentence says to me. This is the place where this action of God is played out in the world. And so, he says, the American government was to be a reflection on earth of cosmic principles through which men and women can live in peace and relationship to a higher and all-encompassing reality. And I think this is quite something.
Does somebody want to come in?
Is somebody coming in?
Jenny.
Oh, we're going to admit her. Here we go. Woo. All right, we're in. Okay, so I'm going to experiment with multimedia with you here, because the next thing that I want us to look at is, so what must we do? We've just been given this narrative of the Native Americans. We've been kind of made to feel very badly about taking away their land, but also removing this kind of thought in the world. And there's an answer here. Now, let's see if this, hopefully this won't start off right on its own here, but let's see if I can do this. Okay. This is a scene, if you've ever seen David Attenborough's movie Gandhi, it's a fabulous film. But this is one of the most pivotal scenes from a true point in the story. Gandhi, because of inner Muslim Hindu violence, is on a fast. He's refusing to eat until there is peace restored throughout all of India. And he is so close to death that he's finally moved people to do this. And you're about to see in this clip a group of Hindus coming to promise to never, to not fight anymore. And I do hope this will work. So let's see how it goes.
It's all promise. We stop.
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Okay, good.
It's a promise. Yeah, eat. Eat. I'm going to hell, but not with your death on my soul. Only God decides who goes to hell. I killed a child. I smashed his head against a wall. Why? They killed my son. My boy. The Muslims killed my son. I know a way out. I am a child whose mother and father have been killed. A little boy who was this time. Raise him as your own. Only be sure that he is a Muslim, that you raise him as one.
Now that is, I think, one of the most, that is, I think, one of the most profound moments in Gandhi's life. That the way out of hell for this man, a Hindu man who had killed a Muslim child in revenge for his own child, was to find a Muslim child and raise it as a Muslim. And in a way, this is what we can do. What must we do? Needleman kind of suggests this here. He says it's clear that the civilization of the American Indian was rooted in the deepest and most refined vision of reality, and the aim of the human life, a metaphysics of comprehensive and subtle as any we may know in the European world from which most of us Americans have come from. An ethic as compassionate and wise as any we know from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and a form of government that was based on a powerful vision of reality and human good. What can we do? We can remember and actually raise that up, that same ideal that we embrace ourselves, remembering it as being something that is rooted in a people that we vanquished when we took possession of this land, ultimately to try and mimic to an extent what was already here. Now, yes, there were wars, there was savagery, there was a lot of things that that have been civilized since that. But there is that sense that what we may be able to do is much like I've tried to display here. It's a little glimpse, even in Syria, I'm saying what he said. If we glimpse even a little that America killed something that was divinely ordained for all humanity and for all the earth, if we can be touched by the feeling that it is a deeply organic response to such an act of human destruction, only then may we perhaps approach a true response and a true direction of recompense, not only to the Indian spirit, but to what we ourselves may recognize as the good. And he says, why not call it God? We are obliged by the laws of conscience to bring to the earth what the Indians brought. Without that, all other compensation and atonement will be perilously incomplete. Open that sentence, you can see what I tried to capture in that scene from the movie Gandhi. The way we can do this is to live out what it was that they had brought the world that essentially we took away from it, that we destroyed. That really is what we attest to be ourselves. We shift gears over here, and primarily what we have for a framework in this next section, the last one we're going to look at tonight, is slavery. And in it, we take an address by Frederick Douglass that was given on the 4th of July in the 1850s, when slavery was still there. Now, he was asked to come and speak on the 4th of July, and he essentially said, spoiler alert, thank you, but this is your holiday, not mine yet, as an African American. He begins, Needleman, by telling us that part of what we do inside this soul searching is to kind of let ourselves off the hook, but also fully embrace our guilt. What he says here is, everywhere and almost all the worlds of man, one sees behind the thin screen of religious and moral idealism the domination of hatred, the brutal exercise of power, the enormities of bloody wars occasioned by paranoia, greed, and the trivialities of pleasure, position, self-importance, and fantastic dreams of salvation or service. We need to situate the American climate of slavery within this picture. Until we can free ourselves from the illusion of our moral uniqueness, our attempts to repair our crimes may never take us where we need to go. Now, don't get triggered at this next picture. I put in there not to be political. He's just, I want you to see in that sense, because he says, unless America can feel itself from its illusion of uniqueness, it will be lost, as is now being lost, to the poisonous effects of this fundamental illusion, either an arrogance that courts its own destruction at the hand of man or nature, or a suicidal cynicism, despair and self-contempt that cast to the wind the very idea that can show it is the goal towards which it must strive. We can get better together, all of us, free of this megalomaniacal illusion. Or finally, an external moral perfectionism that fails to attend to the real inner cause of human barbarity under the illusion that the improvement of outer conditions, imperatively necessary though they may be by all the laws of conscience, by itself will end or even diminish the crimes of man against man. We can't march it into existence. For this picture of dirt here, that's what that wonderful word about humility, humus, that word means to get back on the ground again. Yet at the same time, something entirely new and necessary will fill every limb and cell of the story of America. Humility and the need to experience the taste of genuine remorse. Every human being has within himself the possibility and the capacity to search for what the founders called reason, the real inner God of truth, love, and freedom. Laws by themselves, Needleman says, the Constitution by itself cannot bring justice. We've got to listen to that conscience in all of us. This wonderful person of Douglass, he is a tough nut to crack. I'd love to do a class just on him. You may not know this, for those who know a little bit of history, just as an excursus for a second, he was invited, he knew John Brown intimately, and was invited by John Brown to be a part of the Harper's Ferry raid. John Brown had no delusions of leading a freed slave state. He was just going to act as the catalyst to begin the war. He dreamt of Douglass as being the new leader of African Americans that were freed from slavery. And the way he put it was, when I strike the hive, I must lead them to the queen, which is to say that once he gets it going, he needs Douglass there to act as the leader to inspire the slaves to rally around him, Douglass. And Douglass refused to go. He refused to conscience the raid on Harper's Ferry. In this address, he says these few sentences I want to share from Douglass's address. Fellow citizens, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to their great age. Your fathers loved their country better than their own private lives. And though this is not yet the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. You live and must die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labor. He says here, excuse a little remark there from copying it from my Kindle. Washington could not die until he had broken the chains of his slaves. Yet his monument is built upon the price of human blood, and traitors in the bodies and in souls of men shout, we have Washington to our father. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. He's challenging them with 4th of July. Can you imagine them saying, I wish we had not invited this guy to speak? But lo, he speaks to them from the heart. He says, it is America's greatness that makes it evil so clear and so shocking. This is, I'm sorry, I'm switching gears. This is Needleman. Douglass is thus in effect calling upon America to become the most morally shocked, the most metaphysically shocked people on earth, the people who see and suffer most acutely man's failure to be man, primarily because they are the children of people that had this vision. He says, of course, America must end slavery. Of course, it must repair this crime. This is now Douglass, by the way. And of course, today, America must do everything it can to repair the consequences of this original crime. But America must also see and feel and sense deep in its heart and gut that it is not what it thought it was. It must bow its head at the human condition it represents. Then and only then can a man, a people, or a community really begin to repair its crime, because only then, through this process of remembering what it is and what it was meant to be, only then does it allow into itself the process by which it can repair its own spiritual and moral contradictions. Needleman says, America must remember itself, and it is the slave, the black man living in chains, physically or otherwise, who is the instrument of remembering. Again, not just for condemnation. This for him is the unforgivable sin. Through the perpetuation of slavery, this is Douglass, America is forgetting what it is, and perhaps the word forgetting means to be explained in a manner more explicitly consistent with the meaning and the wisdom traditions of the world. Namely, to forget the self is to deny the divine spirit within a man, to deny the goodness of a man, to deny the purpose of God's creation of man. I'm wrong, this is Needleman. He says, in sum, although these are not Douglass's exact words, the perpetuation of slavery denies the intrinsic conscience of man. It is the great and awful sin against the Holy Spirit, the one sin for which there is no forgiveness. To thwart not only just to the dignity of the slave by making him enslaved, but by being a part of this, you deny your own conscience, which should tell you otherwise. To do evil to another is first and foremost to deny the sacredness of man, and to deny the sacred dignity of man is to blaspheme against the Holy Spirit. Like fallen man itself, America cannot see what it has become. It cannot see its contradictions. It cannot feel that it is not what it imagines itself to be. And so it says, what we see in history is the obvious result of this clash of humanity's repeated descent into barbarism and violence. What is harder to recognize are the occasions in history when the opposing force is understood for what it is, and where a third principle of Christian language, the Holy Spirit, the founding fathers may have said the intelligence, the reason, reconciles the two opposing forces. Such reconciliation is quiet and invisible and takes place behind the scenes in the hearts and minds of individual men and women. There's that individual thing I was harping on at the beginning. The American Constitution was created to allow forces to confront each other in a manner that makes room for the appearance, the descent from above, if one wishes to put it that way, of the reconciling principle that preserves and even deepens unity, union. If we are able to look at fault and yet see also the ability for reconciliation, then we can do something more. The deeper meaning of evil lies here. Evil is that which fatally obstructs the action of the inner reconciling force, which fatally obstructs the descent of the dove, the Holy Spirit, in human life. To resist what is good is not in itself the unforgivable sin. What is unforgivable is to resist the reconciliation of the struggle between good and its antagonist. Essence of America, he says, which will allow the descent from above of the force that will bring reconciliation of white and black. This is the myth, that is to say, the sacred story, the sacred meaning that is echoed by the structures of the American nation. To deny its possibility, to assert that the essential mind and heart of America favors slavery, favors the monstrosity of evil, that would be the unforgivable sin. That would be the death of America. Not a mincing of words here. And then he brings out Douglass here, because what he says is even Douglass says in the 1850s, there's hope. Douglass's final words can show us yet another unexpected and essential aspect of the inner story of America, the unforgivable sin, the denial of the intrinsic goodness of God and man, of God in man, manifests itself inwardly as despair, giving up hope. Hope. This is I believe this is Douglass. Hope, not foolish hope, not childish hope, but hope based on vision and consciousness is necessary. And is this kind of hope the real inner meaning of the story of America? Quoting here from Douglass here. Allow me to say in conclusion, this is his speech made in the 1850s. Notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. He's quoting here Isaiah. The arm of the Lord is not shortened. The doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope. And so the question arises, can we do this? These are some lengthy passages I just couldn't truncate, so please let me read these to you. This is Needleman speaking. He carries a force that acts in a completely interior direction. He brings us to the silence of remorse completely beyond any plans of action, completely beyond any possibility of doing something. And yet it is there in that condition of the encounter with conscience that something beyond ourselves can appear, something that, were it to be more enduring, could transform the life of a man far beyond an immediate but ultimately superficial remedy. Without the experience of genuine remorse, without the intentional effort to return again and again to that experience, injustice and barbarism can change only their name and form, but not their substance in the life of man and nation. So wisdom teaches, and so history shows, America cannot be the hope of the world until it returns to learn that lesson. And so he says, if the American people could put a schoolhouse, this is actually Douglass speaking, at the end of his life in the 1890s, at the opening of a school that was being opened for freed African Americans and their children and grandchildren. If the American people could put a schoolhouse in every valley, a church on every hilltop in the South, and supply them with a teacher and preacher respectively, and welcome the descendants of former slaves to all the moral and intellectual benefits of the one and the other without money and without price, such a sacrifice would not compensate their children for the terrible wrong done to their fathers and mothers by their enslavement and enforced degradation. But he says, The language of the world's wisdom's teachings is there, waiting to serve, waiting to allow the fundamental crimes of America to be seen in their universal meaning. And this means not just our bad thing, but the bad things that have been going on throughout the world and will continue to go on. So the moral action that is needed to be rooted in a deep truth about ourselves, and not only in our anxious self-condemnation, that's very important, or in an unfeeling cloud of self-justification, which is the other possibility, or the futile dream of progress that has so blinded America to what its share of the barbarism that has stained the whole fabric of human history. In short, it's probably not going to get better. Now, this is what I had to bring with you guys today. Let me stop this sharing and return to each other's pretty faces. Hi, guys.
I,
So what I wanted to say as we came through all of this is where I kind of began with our beloved Charles Gore here, my beloved Charles Gore. I hope you like him a little bit now. If we want to make a change, there is a universal aspect to this. Part of it is looking at things and saying, this is who we are, and this is what we have been, but not allowing ourselves inside there, either if when we're African American, to say, see, this is the fundamental evil of America, and that defines it. On the other hand, to not say, well, I've never owned a slave. It's something that helps us to be able to realize that just because it happened to our great-great-great-grandparents, this is something that we continue to do in probably more polite, certainly less graphic ways, less costly. But at the same time, we still are living with the repercussions of this. And if we allow this to be something that brings us, by what he says, to remorse, then what we do is we become humbled and grounded to be able to actually know that we owe our forefathers who gave us these high principles, we owe them to live up to them, but knowing we never will. That's the important thing, I think, that we began with that image of the angel guarding the tree of life. We can't go back into the Garden of Eden. We can't spend our way. We can't march our way. We probably can't even program our way into the kingdom of God. The only way we can do that is by continually every day struggling with our sins as a people, as individuals, as a nation, and trying to use the experience of both our successes and our failures to keep us humble and to keep us hopeful, and always looking for the opportunity to reconcile. Because the truth is, if we don't, then we only hear one side of those two stories. That's what I had to say today. What did you all think about this? I know a lot of you, I know this is a lot to read, and I feel like a very bad college professor. You guys all have day jobs. But I try to synthesize it down for you. What do you think about all this? Sandra, your hand is up.
I struggle with this book because of everything that's going on now, and just the session tonight, a couple of things where it says there are things that have to be killed. Who's the arbiter? Who decides which things really, who decides that?
That is the $1 million question.
And we are so polarized. So what is killable by one section may not even be an issue for another part. And then one other thing you talked about, marching isn't the way to go. And I fully believe in the individual, what we need to do as individuals every single day. But there's a place, if something is so wrong, and Gandhi is an example. What happened in the civil rights movement of the 60s, like there has to, when it's so broken, there has to be both in a way, in my opinion.
Let me say this, and this is not to argue with you, because that's actually in the essence of what we're trying to engage with this. Part of this is, the answer to your question, how do we do that? Who's the arbiter? We the people. And that sounds so banal, but what we've lost the elegance of is compromise and consensus. That happened in the 1850s. You know, we hear the word compromise and we hear complicity or prevarication. And part of what we have to be able to do is to walk with each other and realize that we are never going to find our way into the Garden of Eden. You know, I say that not because it doesn't mean we don't try, but the reality for us is we're never going to have the perfect union. We're going to have a more perfect union. Are you noticing me reaching into our founding ideas of the Constitution there, just to be able to show off a little bit? But you know, it is this idea of how do we do it? We do it together, and we are fractured. I do think that part of the important thing is being able to trumpet, if anything, the message that we can be united, and not only that we can be, we must be. Because you're right, if one side only hears one thing, you know, if we're in the echo chamber, then what happens is that division and that distorted perspective becomes compartmentalized, as opposed to being something that can come together to find not only unity, but transcendent understanding.
Yeah, but how do you do it?
We're doing it right now. And
No, I mean, but I mean, Sandra's right. It's, you know, there's one half of the country and then there's the other half, and you can't even talk to one another without somebody jumping down your throat or attacking, you know, both ways. I mean, it's, you know, one side is not all wrong or all right, you know, but I mean, we're at each other's throats.
I'm going to suggest something, but I don't know if anybody else wants to answer that. Part of what I would say is, here we are. I mean, this is the church.
Yeah.
And I say that not because, you know, I mean, I love my bishop, but I can't change Garden City. I have enough work to change Patrick and in community to be a part of the change that can happen here at St. John's. And I do a little bit at the fire department. I do a little bit of elsewhere. And each of us do. Go ahead, Sandra, you look like you're about to say something. I'm sorry.
Well, I think this, you know, and maybe others in this community, you know, we make soup and we serve, we do good things. And we, as individuals, I think all aspire to making these changes. But at this point in time, it just feels very like there's a level of futility. I mean, where every morning you wake up and you want to not feel that way about what you're hearing or reading.
Right.
But it seems small. It seems like what we can do as individuals just may not be enough at this point.
Jesus Christ, God bless it, point a little head. That sounds sacrilegious. I don't mean it to. He was God. Okay, we'll take that. But he was also one man. His circle of people that he made the most traction with began with 1 and 2 and 3 and then 12. And then even if we think 10,000, reaching out and making messages and not only speaking, but exhibiting it and healing along the way. And I can't change the country. I can try to change Patrick. And in community, I can try and change the terms of how we address each other and live. You know, it is the only way that we can begin to do it, because otherwise we are already at the point beyond futility.
And there's so much misinformation as well. And, you know, one person's truth is not another person's truth. And I think that line of reasonable and ability to discern what is true and what isn't true has been lost.
That's what the joy of the Holy Spirit is. And I tie this back into Christianity with actually intention, is that if what we hope is that God can take a fallen, messed up guy like me and yet still do something good with it, then God can do the same with all of us and all of us in community. One of the terrible things I think about looking at the evening news is it in some way tries to get me invested in the fact that I'm going to do something about what's happening in Myanmar. I can be very concerned about it. I can definitely want to try and see something happen. But, you know, I've got a friend in Myanmar, Moses Hatwa. And, you know, what he's doing out there right now, last I heard from him, is he's running a water station that doesn't just give people something to drink, but also clears tear gas out of their eyes as people are peacefully protesting. That's just peace in this thing. What I can do is be sympathetic, but I'm engaged in trying to change that corner of the kingdom of God that sits around this table and on the Zoom call with me. And the hope is there because we're doing this now. And I know we all don't share the same opinion.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this world is not easy. No one said it was easy. It's very, very difficult. Historically, it's been very difficult. We have lived a very nice time in America. I'm not from here, but there hasn't been a war in this country. We didn't live through that in a long time. And I think this challenge of the factions that have been formed is a terrible thing, but there's nothing we can do. We have to just, like Father Patrick says, have faith in God and know that we're here, we're not this body, we are headed for a better place, and we cannot help every single other individual or change their minds.
At the same time, we can also be open to being changed in our minds too. And maybe they can too.
Yes.
One of the things that also I think is so important, as he said repeatedly, is not to despair of the possibility that something can happen. That line that Douglas gave towards the end of his conversation, I think is so important because it suggests, hey, I know I've kind of painted a black picture here, no pun intended, guys, but I think it's going to get better because God doesn't want it to stay this way. The question for us is, will we be agents of that? And again, I realize the difficulty and certainly everything in our society today will tell us that this is hopeless, that we can't reconcile, that there can't be a solution that takes both our sins and our innate sense of reconciliation and optimism and bring them together while understanding we're never going to fully make it. Because we believe we can. I think that's one thing that really strikes me. I think that there's the phrase that we used to use in college was Whiggish. The idea that we're always going up, we're always going to get better and better and better, and the next generation is going to be better. But also because eventually we're going to solve all these problems. Bless me. World War I, Woodrow Wilson, we're going to make the world safe for democracy. We may just not do that because we can never be complacent. We must always be struggling against something, or else we're not actually going to be able to be true to it. But not being engaged with each other says that it's hopeless. And that's what we can't afford to do.
Yeah, but that seems to be what is happening. You cannot engage unless.
And lo, that's why we're doing this class, because I want to encourage you to get out there and do it. Because I think we can. But this is not, what I think we can see illustrated in these perspectives. I think what Needleman is arguing is we have to. Because if we don't, then really this is a bleak and as he says, this may be the death of America. And I bring it out because I think we're in a really bad. When I was a child, and I'm showing my age here a little bit, we were afraid of the Ruskies. We had our divisions, but it tended to unite us. When you were afraid of a nuclear annihilation, you figured out how to get along together. We have the luxury of being so compartmentalized and fractured. And that may be our most dangerous moment. Unless we realize the risk. And I think it just kind of walked down the path again. We find ourselves facing those very things that separate us. Sins of America, the sins of our society. And then what we say is, we own them, and then we aspire through them. So I was trying to say a little bit about how do we deal with the Native Americans. We remind ourselves that we have fathers to whom we owe a legacy we've been given, and children to whom we owe a legacy to give them of the same ideals and the same hope and the same inspiration. But that's also the Christian walk. Because if we really looked at ourselves, we would be so frustrated at our continual failures to be perfect. It's a lot easier for us to look at ourselves and say, oh, well, I'm human, right? But then again, it's also easy for us to look at someone else and say, sinner. And perhaps even have them look at us and say, okay, I may do X, Y, and Z, but I don't do what you're doing. And that was the one thing that got Jesus angry. You may notice. If you were an adulterer, he'd forgive you. If you were someone who didn't see his own sin, but was able to recognize the sin of others, that was something that made Jesus angry. And I think it's because it's the inability then to be able to not only see your own sin and repent, but also to reconcile with the other.
Father Patrick, do you believe that anything or is anything irredeemable or irreconcilable? I mean, do you believe that everything can reach a point of reconciliation?
Yes, but part of that, I love the thing that he drummed in a lot about accepting that slavery, violence, this is something that happens to everybody and will happen to everybody. Has all throughout time and will happen again. So part of that is that reconciliation is the understanding that we are not going to go back into the Garden of Eden, not until God comes back and fixes us. But in between now and then, there is that process and struggle that helps us to not only see each other's faults, but to be reconciled when we recognize our own. Yes, I think it is. I think it is reconcilable. The problem for us is we've forgotten how. And we've forgotten to take morality and make it something other than moralism. I thought that was an important part of the things we read today, is that when you look at someone and say, aha, you've done something wrong here, that negates any good you may have done or could do. It's important for us to be able to see even, I love that one picture of the QAnon shaman, the guy with the buffalo head on and things like that. I enjoy him because he's such a lightning rod. You look at that and you think, that's one messed up dude. But that is somebody that's got something that we all need, as well as someone who needs to hear from the rest of us as well. So yes, I think that there is the ability to do that. Now, he does say, and I agree, there are some things that need to be killed off, but it's only in the idea of bringing us, hopefully all, to a better place. The world couldn't just let Hitler go. You know, we had to deal with him. Somebody mentioned Gandhi, and I want to just loop back around to him because he's one of my favorite people. For him, it was a national movement that he was trying to organize, but it was always done on the individual level. Each Indian, in his eyes, needed to take upon themselves the idea of non-cooperation. In his instance, what he wanted to do is he wanted the English out. He wasn't trying to reconcile with the English. He thought the English needed to leave India and let the Indians deal with what happened next. So in that sense, what Gandhi was doing was he made each individual person realize that the only way they were going to change the Englishman's mind to leave was to show him the injustice that the Englishman was inflicting. And the way he did that was by allowing the Englishman to hurt him, but not to return the hurt. And part of what may be able an answer for us to be able to begin this reconciliation is to begin with the place that says, I won't demand my right in my engagement with you, and I will not demand my respect even, but I will be with you, and I won't let you, however, continue in something that is in itself against the morality and the ideals of Christ and our nation. And that's a different thing. That's meeting someone and drawing them in. I hope that was somewhere close to an answer.
I worry about the fact that there's half of the country is very set on one path. The other half is very set on the other. And there's no commonality in there.
And yet, lo, we are all fallen creatures of God.
True.
We all aspire. I mean, this was, oh God, I'm thinking about now a little history lesson here, but I was thinking about this wonderful letter that was sent to JFK from Khrushchev during the worst moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was what saved the world,
Yeah.
because what happened was when he, that incredible Saturday night when he looked into the camera and said, a full retaliatory response from the United States on the Soviet Union. If you know what I'm talking about, that speech that Kennedy made, where he essentially said, one missile gets fired, I don't care where it's aimed. We're acting like it came from the Soviet Union aimed at us, and we're going to send the rockets. And Khrushchev wrote a letter to him that came across a telex, and it was this emotionalized thing where he said, we all have our children and we aspire to them to have a life. Let us not pull so tightly on the knot of this conflict that we cannot untie it. That's a moment in human history in which, two polar opposites, warring people, realized that the stakes were so high. What they had to do was to say, I just won't do this. And I hear what you're saying. I absolutely agree with it. It's terrible what's happening right now. But at some point we have to untie this. Am I doing something?
No, I was just gonna make a comment.
Oh, excuse me.
rather than-
My wife usually sneaks up behind me when it's time for me to shut up or something. So yes, dear.
So I was thinking about what Pat said about half the country this and half the country that, and it occurs to me that the only way that it would be true that 50% of the country thinks one thing and 50% thinks the other thing is that each side has manipulated the universe of things that we can argue about. They've manipulated it so that they can get, 50.5% of the people over on their side.
Vehemently.
Am I making sense?
Yeah.
We wouldn't naturally fall out 50-50, but there are people who are making plans to manipulate and tear us apart. And Facebook,
Oh, social media is it? Yeah. Yeah,
social
definitely.
media and the regular media, the news, there are so many people conspiring to tear us apart that I think part of the first order of business is to rebel against that and say, I'm not going to allow you to provoke me, because everybody can find a point of connection. If you're politically completely opposed to someone else, there's still areas, right? There's still areas.
Oh, there's a lot of areas.
You could agree. There are a lot of areas that you could agree, but I think people get it in their mind that if I'm with these people, then I have to 100% agree with these people and 100% disagree with those people. And life just isn't that way. So I think our rebellion has to be to work to find, maybe you can't start by talking about the contentious things. Maybe you can start by making the connection between you and your opposition about something that you both care about that doesn't have anything to do with politics, and build a foundation with that person. And then when the contentious things come, then you would have a relationship with that person.
If I may, I think that's part of why Needleman began with myths and stories and legends of Americans' founders, because we can all kind of get excited about George Washington, can't we?
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of gotten tarnished a little bit, but can we afford to lose that? It's one of the things I love about going to the mall in Washington, all these monuments that seem to draw us together and saying, oh yeah, that guy, we belong, these folks that we identify with as a people.
So
So where do we go from here? Well, that's next week. Because when we look towards what's going to happen next week, we kind of jump into some of his drawing conclusions. He talks about in the next section the two democracies, the wound and the turning, and this idea of in search of the second democracy. And Walt Whitman in The Meaning of America. This is kind of where we're coming to our closes here, but he gives some ideas about how to move next. And I hope you can join us next week because I think it will answer a little more of the conversations we're having here. Anybody else want to say something? I see a few faces with tension that seem like there's more to be thought of.
Really.
Well, what's that?
It's my cat.
Oh, excuse me.
I agree with,
Cat is trying to help.
I agree with Deborah. I think the press and the media is big business now, and they will do whatever to get people's attention. And if we bite and, get persuaded by them, it's just terrible. It's a business for them. We have to understand that. And we are falling for it.
It's the ratings.
They
Ratings equal
make-
money. Yep.
Yes, look at Facebook, Twitter, all the tech, they're making more and more money on our fights because they
Yeah.
really, everybody goes in and then they send more and more ads and they make more and more money, and that's what's happening. And we can't be victims of that. We just have to rebel against that.
I think it would be great if everybody just got off Facebook and Twitter and everything. And they would, obviously they would have to stop because there's no audience. But I sincerely doubt that will happen.
It's getting bigger and bigger, but
Yes, it is.
we can't despair about it. We can't be brought down because that's what they want. They want to bring us down, but God wants to lift us. So who do we listen to? That is my point.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Also the voice that draws us together.
Yes.
Mhm.
So, and we are part of God. We can stay with God. We don't have to go down with the media and the fights and, give in to all that. So that's what I think.
Do you think that the I guess attack, I would say, on the Capitol will wake up people, will make them more aware of what this has actually driven us to?
That was a dramatic on TV, and I'm afraid that I apologize for putting the QAnon shaman on, because I think it almost has become another wedge that divides. I hear what
No.
you're saying. The thing that I was driven to that day was I thought about the fact that in the 1850s, there was actually somebody that was nearly beaten to death on the floor of the Senate.
Yeah,
By a fellow senator.
yeah,
And I think I'm deeply unhappy with what happened on the 6th of January. But that was where we actually had a member of the Senate trying to kill another member of the Senate. And I say that because it was emblematic of the divisions that was happening in our country. The wake up for us, must, in my opinion, come from us looking inside of ourselves to find not only the humanity to reach out to others, despite the really quite formidable divisiveness and divisive institutions that we have employed against us, but also to find the hope that it is not futile. One of the things I used to say to people that are getting a divorce is that divorce is ultimately a failure to give and receive grace. And sometimes we may find ourselves coming to that conclusion in the end of things. But I think that's true for the divisions in our country. It is a failure to give and receive grace.
yeah. I mean, I think that as I was watching that, of course, obviously, your first thought or my first thought was, I mean, I can't believe they're doing this. Do they understand what they're doing? And then I thought to myself, maybe I don't understand what they're doing. There's a level of frustration there that I'm not identifying with. I can't identify with because I don't have that frustration. And I thought about it quite a bit.
Well, that is probably, if I can say something, what Father Patrick was saying about marches. What happens during marches is that people dramatize too much, and then they get high on this feeling. They really don't know where it's coming from. And then they crazy things, and they did it on both sides, because Seattle, I don't know if it's still going, and all the marches that were, all the riots and everything, they were all over the country. And people dramatize it, and then the TV and the media just keep on feeding on it. It was terrible, but it was, like I said, on both sides, and they have no purpose, marches, except to,
It's a good
Because
way, it's a
yeah.
good way to wake people up. Because what you're trying to do is you're demonstrating, and it's an interesting word. A demonstration is something that shows that there's a problem.
Right.
Demonstrations don't necessarily cause solutions, in as much as that they may inspire some sort of engagement. Even this class itself, this time we're studying together, has to be something that engages us on a personal level, in personal interaction, or else it's just something that's been an intellectual engagement that we've enjoyed, and maybe it has helped us to solidify an understanding of something when we move forward. It's a call. It's a call to believe and to act on our beliefs.
yeah, action. Mohammed Yunus has a beautiful doctrine called reconciliation. And he really tried to bring it in third world countries. A lot of people tried it, and I think it just kind of died away, but it can be done. And he was very successful in South Africa and in other places where they followed this doctrine, that they actually do things, not just go out and demonstrate for it, but just get groups of people together that are fighting against each other, and they reconcile their differences or try to talk about them. That's something that people maybe should look into it. It's a beautiful doctrine and a method. It's a methodology of
Truth and
reconciliation.
reconciliation.
Yeah,
Yeah, what they did in South Africa began with truth telling, but it was always with the goal of reconciliation.
yes.
Truth is told, but only then can we reconcile. Well, friends, we have come to 7:30 or a little bit past that. Thank you so much for being with us this week. A lot. I appreciate it. And I hope that you will have a blessed week, and we'll see you hopefully on Sunday on Zoom or Twitter, or not Twitter, on Facebook, and hopefully see you this time next week, or 6 o'clock next week. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Hope it was
Thank
worth your
you.
time.
Good night.
Yes, thank you. Friends.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank